9 experienced hikers walked into the Russian wilderness in January 1959. They never walked out. When rescuers found their tent 3 weeks later, it had been cut open from the inside. The hikers had fled into negative 30-degree weather wearing only socks. No shoes. No coats. Just pure terror. What they found next defied explanation. One body had her tongue missing. Another had his eyes gone. A third had skull fractures consistent with a car crash, but there were no cars. No avalanche. No animal attacks. The Soviet government classified the case immediately. For decades, the file stayed buried. But here's what they didn't want you to know. The last photo on their camera shows something in the darkness outside their tent. Something that made 9 people choose freezing to death over staying inside. This is the Dyatlov Pass Incident, the mystery that has haunted investigators for 65 years. Before we dive in, if you're into mysteries that have real evidence, real bodies, and 0 satisfying answers, subscribe now. This one's going to mess with your head. February 1959. The Soviet Union. Stalin had been dead for 6 years, but his paranoia lived on. The Cold War was heating up. Nuclear testing was constant. And in the remote Ural Mountains, something happened that the government desperately wanted to hide. The location matters. The indigenous Mansi people called it Kolet Sayakal. Translation, Dead Mountain. They refused to go there. They had legends about 9 hunters who died there centuries ago. About strange lights in the sky. About a place where people simply vanished. The Soviets ignored the warnings. They saw the Urals as a training ground. A place to build tough citizens. A place where young people could prove their loyalty to the motherland through winter expeditions. Igor Dyatlov was 23 years old. 5th-year engineering student. Radio enthusiast. Experienced hiker who had led multiple winter expeditions. He was planning the adventure of a lifetime. A 200-mile trek through the northern Urals in the dead of winter. Category 3 difficulty, the highest Soviet rating. Only the most experienced hikers attempted it. He assembled a team of 9 others. All students or recent graduates. All experienced. All physically fit. They ranged from 20 to 37 years old. They had completed dozens of expeditions between them. This wasn't a group of amateurs making rookie mistakes. These were people who knew how to survive. The plan was simple: ski and snowshoe from one side of the mountains to the other. 10 days, maybe 12. They would check in by telegram when they arrived. If they were late, send help. Standard procedure. They departed on January 27, 1959. 10 people initially. One, Yuri Yudin, turned back on day 2 due to illness. He would be the only survivor. And for the rest of his life, he would wonder why fate spared him that day. The remaining 9 continued into the wilderness. They kept detailed diaries. They took photos. They documented everything like good Soviet students. Those diaries and photos would become evidence in one of history's strangest investigations. Their last known position was February 1st. They were setting up camp on the slopes of Kolet Sayakal. Against standard practice. In the open. In the killing zone of potential avalanches. These experienced hikers chose the worst possible campsite. But that question would haunt investigators. Because everything that happened next suggested these 9 people knew something, feared something, and made decisions that make no sense unless they were absolutely terrified. Let's meet the 9 people who walked into that mountain and never walked out. Igor Dyatlov, the leader, engineering student with a brilliant mind. He built his own radio equipment, designed heating systems for tents. He wasn't just experienced, he was innovative. His friends called him cautious to the point of paranoia about safety. So why did he make so many dangerous decisions on this trip? Zina Ida Kolmogorova, 22 years old. Economics student. 4 years of hiking experience. Known for her physical endurance and mental toughness. Her diary entries were optimistic, excited. She had no idea what was coming. Ludmila Dubinina, 20 years old. Economics student. Passionate about hiking. Loud, funny, the life of the expedition. She kept the most detailed diary. Her last entry was February 1st, cheerful. normal. By that night, she would be dead in the most disturbing way possible. Alexander Kolevatov, 24, physics student. Serious. The navigator. If anyone knew where they were and where they should go, it was him. So why did they camp where they did? Rustam Slobodin, 23, engineering student. Reliable. Had climbed mountains across the Soviet Union. Nothing in his experience prepared him for what happened on that mountain. Yuri Doroshenko, 21, economic student. Another experienced hiker. Close friend of Dyatlov. They had survived harsh conditions together before. Not this time. Yuri Krivoniskenko, 23, engineering student. Worked on nuclear projects. This detail would become significant later. Some theorists believe he knew something about what was happening in those mountains. Something classified. Something deadly. Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, 24, engineering student. French ancestry, which was unusual in Soviet Russia. Athletic. He would be found with injuries so severe they suggested impossible forces. Semyon Zolotaryov, 37 years old. The oldest. The mysterious one. He joined the expedition at the last minute. He had military experience, wore military gear. He had medals but wouldn't talk about how he earned them. Who was he really? And why did he join this expedition? The first days were normal. Their photos show them laughing, playing in the snow, building snowmen. The diaries talk about cold weather, hard terrain, but nothing unusual. Standard winter hiking complaints. January 31st. They cached extra food and equipment to lighten their loads for the final push. This was smart planning. They would retrieve it on the return journey. They never would. February 1st. Their last day alive. The diaries mention visibility issues. Strong winds. Heavy snow. Difficult conditions. They decided to make camp early rather than push forward. Again, this seems like smart decision-making. But here's where it gets weird. Instead of camping in the tree line where they had shelter from wind, they chose to camp on an exposed slope. In the open. Where winds would be strongest and avalanche danger highest. Dyatlov, the cautious leader, approved this. The experienced team didn't question it. But the last photo on their cameras shows them setting up the tent. Working together. No signs of distress. Then there's a gap. Hours of missing time. When the cameras picked up again, everything had gone wrong. One photo, the last one, is strange. It's blurry. Taken from inside the tent. It shows what might be lights outside. Or it might show nothing. It's too unclear to tell. But someone took that photo. Someone saw something. And whatever it was, it scared them badly. That night, February 1st, something happened on Dead Mountain. Something so terrifying that 9 experienced hikers cut through their tent from the inside and ran into the frozen wilderness to their deaths. February 12th. The group was supposed to check in by telegram. They didn't. The expedition organizers weren't immediately worried. Delays happened. Weather could slow anyone down. Give them a few more days. February 15th. Still no word. The University of Ural Sports Club, which had authorized the expedition, started getting nervous. 4 days overdue was concerning. But they knew Dyatlov. He was capable. Probably just delayed by storms. February 20th. 1 week overdue. Families were demanding action. The authorities finally agreed to search. But here's the thing, they weren't particularly rushed about it. Winter expeditions went wrong sometimes. Usually hikers turned up embarrassed but alive. The search party consisted of students and staff volunteers. Then the military joined. Then police. The fact that so many agencies got involved so quickly suggests something. The authorities knew more than they were saying. This wasn't treated like a normal rescue operation. This was treated like a recovery operation from day one. February 26th. 3 weeks after the group vanished. The search party found the tent. And immediately knew something was catastrophically wrong. The tent was partially collapsed under snow. That was normal. What wasn't normal was how the hikers had left it. The entrance was still tied shut from the inside. Nobody had exited through the door. Instead, The tent had been cut open from the inside. Long, deliberate cuts. Made with knives. Made by people desperate to get out fast. The search party found footprints leading away from the tent down the slope. Here's where it gets disturbing. Most of the footprints were barefoot or in socks. In negative 30 degrees Celsius weather. That's negative 22 Fahrenheit. Exposed skin freezes in minutes. Inside the tent, everything was still there. Boots, coats, warm clothes, food. Even Dyatlov's jacket was neatly folded. Nobody had taken time to dress. They had fled in whatever they wore to bed. But the footprints suggested 8 or 9 people walking, not running. They were orderly, organized. This wasn't blind panic. This was controlled evacuation. Like they were following orders. But whose orders? And what? The searchers followed the footprints down the slope toward the tree line, about 1.5 kilometers away. That's nearly a mile. Walking that distance in socks in that temperature is essentially suicide. They knew this. They did it anyway. At the forest edge, they found the first bodies. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonischenko. Both dead. Both wearing minimal clothing. They were found under a large cedar tree. Someone had tried to climb the tree. Branches were broken up to 5 meters high. What were they trying to see? Or escape from? The area around the tree showed signs of a fire. A small one, barely adequate for warmth. The 2 Yuris had tried to build it bigger. There were freshly cut branches nearby. But they froze to death anyway. Hypothermia takes about an hour in those conditions if you're not dressed properly. They had lasted longer, which meant they had help. Others had been with them, keeping them alive. Where were those others? Then the searchers found something that would puzzle investigators for decades. The tree branches that were broken off, high up in the tree, showed signs of being burned. But the tree itself wasn't on fire. Someone had held burning branches up in the tree. Creating light? Signaling? Fighting something off? 300 meters from the cedar tree, back toward the tent but not in a straight line, they found Igor Dyatlov. He was on his back. Arms positioned like he had been crawling. He had made it nearly halfway back to the tent before dying. He wore slightly more clothing than the 2 Yuris, suggesting he had taken clothes from them after they died. He was trying to get back. Trying to reach supplies. He almost made it. Another 330 meters away, they found Zinaida Kolmogorova. She had made it even closer to the tent. She was face down in the snow, her hands clenched. She had fought hard against the cold. And lost. Between Zinaida and Igor, they found Rustam Slobin. He was positioned oddly, like he had fallen and couldn't get up. Later examination would show he had a skull fracture. Not severe enough to kill him immediately, but enough to disorient him. Enough to end his desperate crawl back to shelter. 5 bodies. All showing signs of hypothermia. All inadequately dressed. All died trying to either reach the tent or survive at the tree line. Where were the other 4? The search continued. The military brought in helicopters, search dogs, dozens of soldiers. They combed every meter of that mountainside. They found equipment. Scattered belongings. Pieces of clothing. But no more bodies. March came. The snow began to melt. And on May 4th, nearly 3 months after the incident, a search party found what they were looking for. And what they found made the case go from mysterious to absolutely terrifying. In a ravine about 75 meters from the cedar tree, buried under 4 meters of snow, they found the remaining 4 hikers. Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevitov, Semyon Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles. They weren't spread out. They were together. Huddled. Like they had been trying to keep warm. Or hiding. Their clothing situation was bizarre. Some wore clothes taken from the others. Ludmila wore Semyon's coat. Semyon wore someone else's pants. They had been taking clothes from the dying to keep the living warm longer. But here's what made investigators stop cold: their injuries. Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles had massive skull fractures. Not from falling. Not from hitting his head on ice. These were impact fractures. The medical examiner compared them to the force of a car crash. His temporal bone was crushed inward. What could do that in the middle of a wilderness with no vehicles, no rocks, No trees tall enough to create that impact. Ludmila Dubinina had even worse injuries. Multiple rib fractures. Her chest had been crushed with such force that her ribs broke and bent. The medical examiner noted that this level of trauma required extreme force, like being hit by a car, or an explosion, again, in an empty wilderness. But the most disturbing detail, Ludmila was missing her tongue. Not cut out, torn out, gone from the root. Her eyes were also missing. The official report said decomposition and scavenging. But she was found face down in snow and ice. What scavenger works in those conditions? Alexander Kolevatov had similar eye damage. Missing soft tissue around the face. The report again blamed decomposition. But the bodies were frozen. Decomposition doesn't happen in frozen bodies. Semyon Zolotaryov, the mysterious older member, had multiple rib fractures and a crushed chest cavity. Like the others, massive blunt force trauma without external wounds. His injuries were internal, catastrophic, fatal. But his skin showed no signs of the impact that caused them. The medical examiner, Boris Vozrozdeny, was baffled. He wrote in his report, "These injuries are similar to those sustained in high-speed car accidents. However, there is an absence of soft tissue damage that would normally accompany such trauma." Translation: something hit them with the force of a vehicle, but left no bruises, no external injuries, no signs of impact. How is that possible? The 4 in the ravine had survived the longest. While the others died of hypothermia relatively quickly, these 4 had found shelter. They had pooled their clothing. They had tried to survive. And something found them anyway. Something that crushed their bones and tore out their tongues. The investigators brought in radiation experts. They tested the clothing and found something that would fuel conspiracy theories for decades. Several items of clothing showed elevated radiation levels. Not dangerous levels, but higher than normal background radiation. Specifically, Semyon's jacket and Ludmila's pants. Where did the radiation come from? The official explanation was that Krivonischenko worked in a nuclear facility. Maybe his clothes were contaminated and others wore them. But the radiation wasn't on his clothes. It was on clothing that belonged to people who had never been near nuclear facilities. The case was classified. The investigation closed. The official ruling, death by hypothermia caused by an unknown compelling force. Read that again. Unknown compelling force. The Soviet government, which had an explanation for everything, which never admitted uncertainty, officially stated that something unknown killed these people. And then they buried the case for decades. The lead investigator was Lev Ivanov, an experienced prosecutor. He approached the case methodically. He interviewed witnesses. He examined evidence. He visited the site multiple times. And what he found disturbed him deeply. In his initial reports, he noted several things that didn't make the final documentation. Monsey hunters reported seeing bright flying spheres in the sky on the night of February 1st. Multiple independent witnesses. All describing the same thing. Orange glowing objects moving through the sky near Dead Mountain. Another expedition group about 50 kilometers away reported seeing strange lights on February 1st. They described them as flares, but noted they lasted much longer than normal flares and moved in ways that flares don't move. Ivanov wanted to investigate these reports. He was ordered not to. His superiors told him the lights were irrelevant. Focus on the facts. The bodies. The tent. Forget the lights. But Ivanov couldn't forget them. Because when he examined the scene, he found things that supported the witness accounts. Burn marks on trees that weren't consistent with the campfire. Scorched vegetation in patches away from any fire source. And the bodies themselves showed signs of something he couldn't explain. The radiation was one thing. Contamination could be explained. But the pattern of injuries bothered him. The massive internal trauma with no external wounds. The selective nature of who was injured severely and who died of exposure. It felt deliberate. Targeted. Like something had chosen who to hurt. He wanted to pursue this angle. He was ordered to close the case immediately. On May 28, 1959, less than a month after finding the last bodies, the case was officially closed. The conclusion, Death by hypothermia caused by an unknown compelling force. The files were classified. Access was restricted to authorized personnel only. The families were told their children died in a tragic hiking accident. Details were withheld for security reasons. When they asked questions, they were told to stop asking. This was the Soviet Union. You didn't question official conclusions. But Lev Ivanov never stopped questioning. In 1990, after the Soviet Union collapsed, he gave an interview. He was old, dying. He had nothing to lose anymore. And he told the truth about what he believed happened on Dead Mountain. I suspected at the time and am almost sure now that these bright flying spheres had a direct connection to the deaths of the Dyatlov group, he said. He explained that he had been pressured from the very beginning to avoid any mention of the lights. Military officials attended the investigation meetings. They took notes. They gave instructions. And they made it clear, the lights didn't exist. But what were the lights? Ivanov believed they were military tests of some kind. Rockets. Maybe weapons. Something classified that went wrong. The hikers saw something they shouldn't have. Or were in the wrong place during a test. And the government covered it up to avoid admitting the accident. But that theory doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the injuries. It doesn't explain why the hikers cut their way out of the tent. It doesn't explain the missing tongue. Other investigators pointed to the Baikonur Cosmodrome, the Soviet space launch facility. February 1959 was a busy time for rocket tests. Multiple launches happened that month. Could a rocket have malfunctioned? Could debris have fallen near the hikers? Could they have been killed by accident and the government covered it up? This theory gained traction. It explained the lights. It explained the government's immediate involvement. It explained the radiation on the clothing. Rocket fuel contains radioactive isotopes. If debris fell near them, it could contaminate clothing. But it still doesn't explain how they died. A rocket falling from the sky doesn't cause internal injuries without external trauma. It doesn't remove tongues. It doesn't make experienced hikers abandon their tent in deadly cold. The most recent official explanation, released by Russian authorities in 2019, blamed an avalanche. They used computer modeling to show how a small avalanche could have hit the tent, forcing the hikers to cut their way out and flee. They froze while waiting for the danger to pass. This theory solves some problems. It explains why they left the tent suddenly. It explains the rib fractures in some victims, avalanche impact. It's neat. It's simple. It closes the case without admitting government wrongdoing. But experienced avalanche researchers have rejected this conclusion. The slope angle was too gentle for avalanches. There was no avalanche debris. The tent was still standing, just collapsed from snow weight. A real avalanche would have buried it completely. And most damning, the footprints led away from the tent in organized lines. People fleeing an avalanche don't walk calmly. They run in panic. These footprints showed controlled evacuation. So if it wasn't an avalanche, wasn't hypothermia, wasn't a rocket accident, what killed them? For 65 years, investigators, researchers, and conspiracy theorists have tried to solve the Dyatlov Pass mystery. Let's examine the main theories and the evidence for each. Theory 1. Military testing gone wrong. This is the most popular theory. The Soviet military conducted frequent weapons tests in the Urals. Maybe the hikers stumbled into a test zone. Maybe they witnessed something classified. Maybe they were accidentally killed and the government covered it up. Evidence supporting this: the immediate military involvement, the classified files, the radiation on clothing, the witness reports of lights in the sky, the fact that Krivonischenko worked on nuclear projects and might have known about testing schedules, the government's desperate need to close the case quickly. Evidence against this: the injuries don't match any known weapon. Chemical weapons leave traces. Explosives leave debris and burns. Firearms leave wounds. These bodies had massive internal trauma with no external signs. No weapon does that. Also, if the military accidentally killed civilians, the standard Soviet response was to make the bodies disappear entirely. Why leave them to be found? Why investigate at all? Theory 2. Infrasound-induced panic. This theory suggests natural infrasound caused the hikers to panic. Infrasound is sound below the range of human hearing, around 19 Hz or lower. It can be created by wind passing over mountains. Studies show infrasound can cause feelings of dread, anxiety, and panic in humans. Some frequencies can even cause visual hallucinations. The theory goes, strong winds that night created infrasound. The hikers experienced overwhelming panic and fear. They cut the tent and fled in irrational terror. They died of exposure during this panic episode. Evidence supporting this, the wind conditions were right for infrasound generation. The hikers' actions suggest irrational fear. They fled from shelter into deadly cold. Infrasound would explain why experienced hikers made deadly mistakes. It would explain why they cut the tent instead of using the exit. Panic makes people do irrational things. Evidence against this. Infrasound causes panic, but it doesn't cause skull fractures. It doesn't remove tongues. It doesn't explain the radiation. It doesn't explain why they stayed together and tried to survive after fleeing. If they were in panic, they would have scattered. They would have run individually. Instead, they worked together at the cedar tree. They shared clothing. This was organized survival, not panic. Theory 3. Animal attack or Yeti. Some theorists suggest the group was attacked by an animal. Maybe a bear. Maybe something unknown. The Montse legends speak of creatures in the mountains. Could the hikers have encountered something unexpected? Evidence supporting this. The missing soft tissue on Ludmilla and Alexander could be scavenging. Animals do eat the soft parts first, eyes, tongue, lips. The panic could have been caused by an animal approaching the tent. Large animals can cause fear severe enough to make people flee. Evidence against this. Where are the animal tracks? The search party found human footprints but no animal tracks. Bears hibernate in February. What bear would be active in that cold? And no animal causes internal injuries without external wounds. Animals bite. They scratch. They leave marks. These bodies had none of that. Just internal crushing trauma. The Yeti theory is fun but completely unsupported. No evidence. Just folklore. Theory 4. Paradoxical undressing and hypothermia. This is the boring theory. The one officials want you to believe. Something minor caused them to leave the tent. Maybe a small avalanche, maybe a tent fire, maybe carbon monoxide from a stove. They planned to wait briefly then return. But they got disoriented. Hypothermia set in. Paradoxical undressing is a real phenomenon where people freeze to death and feel hot, so they remove clothing. This explains the scattered clothing. They died of exposure. The injuries came from falls on ice or postmortem damage. Evidence supporting this. Paradoxical undressing is real. Hypothermia is the confirmed cause of death for at least 5 victims. The scattered clothing matches hypothermia behavior. This is the simplest explanation requiring the fewest assumptions. Evidence against this. Paradoxical undressing doesn't explain the skull fractures and crushed chests. It doesn't explain why they cut the tent. If there was a fire or avalanche, why not mention it in the last diary entries? Why camp in such a dangerous location? These were experienced hikers who knew hypothermia risks. Why make so many fatal mistakes? Theory 5. Government execution. The darkest theory suggests the hikers were deliberately killed by the KGB or military. Maybe they witnessed something classified. Maybe one of them was suspected of espionage. Maybe they were used as test subjects for weapons. The government then staged the scene to look like an accident. Evidence supporting this. The immediate classification of the case. The military presence during investigation. The fact that one hiker, Zolotaryov, had a mysterious military background and joined at the last minute. Was he KGB? Was he sent to spy on the others? Or to lead them into a trap? The specific nature of injuries suggests weapons testing. The radiation suggests exposure to military materials. The removal of soft tissue could be torture or experimentation. The government's desperate cover-up suggests they had something to hide. Evidence against this. Why kill them in such a complicated way? The KGB was efficient. A bullet. A staged car accident. Disappearance. Those were standard methods. Why create this elaborate mystery that draws attention? If the goal was silence, they failed. This case became internationally famous. The opposite of a successful cover-up. Theory 6, Rocket Accident. This theory suggests a Soviet rocket or missile test went wrong. The hikers saw the malfunction. Maybe debris fell near them. Maybe the blast wave knocked them down. Maybe the rocket fuel contaminated their clothing. The government covered up the accident to avoid admitting their missiles were unreliable during the height of the Cold War. Evidence supporting this: multiple witnesses saw lights in the sky that night. The radiation on clothing matches rocket fuel isotopes. The Soviet military was actively testing rockets in February 1959. The Urals were a designated test zone. The immediate military involvement suggests they knew what happened. The injuries could be from a blast wave. Internal trauma without external wounds is consistent with pressure wave damage. Evidence against this: where's the debris? Where's the crater? The search party combed every meter of that area. They found no rocket parts, no blast damage, no signs of any explosion. A rocket crash leaves evidence. This scene had none. Also, if a rocket fell, the logical response is to run away from it, not toward the forest. Their path suggests organized retreat, not fleeing from an immediate threat. Theory 7, Something Unknown. And then there's the theory that bothers people most. The one that says we simply don't know. That something happened on Dead Mountain that doesn't fit our current understanding. Not supernatural. Not aliens. Just something we can't explain yet with available evidence. The medical examiner said it best: unknown compelling force. 9 people died in circumstances that don't make sense. Their injuries defy explanation. Their behavior was rational and irrational simultaneously. The evidence is contradictory. The official investigations were compromised. And after 65 years, we still don't have a satisfying answer. Maybe we never will. Remember Yuri Yudin? The 10th member who turned back due to illness? He lived until 2013. For 54 years, he carried the weight of being the only survivor. And he never stopped trying to understand what killed his friends. Yudin gave many interviews over the years. His story never changed. On January 28th, the second day of the expedition, he woke up with severe joint pain. Probably rheumatism flaring up from the cold. He couldn't continue. Dyatlov made the decision to send him back. Yudin said goodbye to his friends. He watched them ski away into the wilderness. He never saw them again. I said goodbye to them, he recalled in a 2008 interview. I can still see them waving. They were happy. Excited. Igor had planned this route for months. They were looking forward to it. There was nothing wrong. Nothing strange. Just a normal expedition. But Yudin noted something that bothered him later. Igor was meticulous about planning. He knew every kilometer of that route. So why did they camp where they did on February 1st? That location made no sense. Igor would never camp there unless something forced him to. Yudin spent decades investigating his friends' deaths. He attended every official hearing. He pushed for investigations when the government wanted the case to stay buried. He examined the evidence personally. He visited the site multiple times. And he came to a conclusion that disturbed him. Something scared them out of that tent, he said. I've camped in worse weather. I've faced storms, cold, dangerous situations. You don't cut your way out of shelter and run into deadly cold unless you're absolutely terrified. Whatever they saw, whatever they heard, it was worse than freezing to death. Think about that. They chose certain death over staying in that tent. Yudin rejected the avalanche theory completely. I know avalanches. Every experienced hiker knows avalanches. That slope couldn't avalanche. The snow wasn't right. The angle wasn't right. And even if it did, you don't cut the tent. You dig out. You recover your gear. You survive. They were experienced. They would know what to do. He also rejected the paradoxical undressing theory. Ludmila was missing her tongue. Not from decomposition. Torn out. I saw the photos. That's not natural. Something did that to her. I don't know what. But something. In his final interviews before his death, Yudin admitted he had no answers. I've studied this for over 50 years. I've read every report, seen every photo, talked to every investigator. And I still don't know what killed them. I know the official explanations are wrong. But I don't know what's right. Maybe we're not supposed to know. Maybe some things are beyond our understanding. Or maybe the people who know what happened are keeping quiet. The government knows something. They've always known. But they'll never tell. Yudin died in 2013 at age 75. His last wish was to be buried next to his friends at the cemetery in Ekaterinburg. He wanted to be with them again. The expedition that left with 10 people in 1959 would be reunited, finally, in death. But Yudin left behind something important. In 2008, he released personal photos and diary entries from the expedition that had never been made public. Photos of the group's final days. Diary entries that showed their mood, their decisions, their last thoughts. One photo in particular caught researchers' attention. Taken on January 31st, the day before they died. It shows the group gathered around a campfire. 9 smiling faces. But in the background, barely visible, there's something odd. A light in the trees. Just a small point of light. Could be a flashlight. Could be a reflection. Or could be